He had built an empire with his words, until one sentence tore it all down. The room was brighter than he remembered, too bright, as if the fluorescent light was keen to witness every crack. Glass walls framed a city that continued to hum outside, unconcerned. Inside, voices had narrowed to a single sharp frequency: accusation. Papers lay in angular piles, coffee rings bloomed like old wounds. At the head of the table, Ethan Hale felt the chair under him as if it were a verdict. "That's on you, Ethan," Priya said, and there was no plea in her voice now, only the hard edges of truth. Ari's jaw clenched. Ben stared at his phone until the screen lit his eyes with news feeds. Samira, who had once defended him in meetings, sat still, fingers folded, watching as if watching a man she no longer recognized. He hadn't meant to say what he said. He'd meant to sound decisive. He'd meant to end a cycle of indecision with finality. Instead, one line, meant to close the room, had opened it, a sentence layered in blame, a tone that carried a slash. For months it had been happening in microdoses, rhetorical jabs that cut trust into ribbons, unguarded jokes that landed as dismissal, offhand comments that undermined. Today, a client walked. Today, a major product rollout began unspooling. Today, the board wanted names. Ethan's mouth tasted of iron. The applause that had once followed his presentations had long since curdled into the silence that now spread across the table. He had always believed his authority came from certainty, of vision, of decisions, of being the person who gave direction. But in that moment, certainty felt different. His certainty had been a brittle thing, polished and brittle enough to fracture at the smallest pressure. He left the room under the same fluorescent light, but now the building seemed colder, its corridors like a hospital ward where broken things were quietly catalogued. In the lift, he caught his reflection, an expression he used to reserve for conflict, a fixed-set jaw, eyes that sized up the next opponent. Not a look of a leader, he thought, but of someone on the defensive. At home, his apartment felt like a stage set, furniture in place, but voices missing. The walls that once held framed awards now held only the echo of meetings. He walked to his desk and pulled open a drawer he rarely used. Inside, there was a small leather notebook, pages filled in years when the pressure had felt like possibility rather than threat. He flipped it open. The handwriting was a map of his ascent, crisp priorities, decisive verbs, plans that glittered with potential. On the margin of one page, in a different ink and a smaller hand, someone had written a note he couldn't remember. "Words build scaffolding. Watch your load-bearing beams." The thought landed like a stone. He slept badly. When dawn came, it found him awake, running through the meeting in his head the way a man replays a car crash.
Every phrase, every facial reaction, a frame in a complicit film. There was an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with shame. He had always been able to fix things, business plans, partnerships, optics. He had not been able to fix himself. Word spread fast. Rumors are the ultraviolet light of organizations. They illuminate weak things. 2 board members called for his resignation in private. A Slack channel that had been a place for shared jokes became a paper trail of complaints. The PR team drafted statements. People who owed him favors stepped back. A quiet mutiny crept under the surface. He started to identify the pattern, not with the clinical certainty of diagnosis. There would be no labels here, just with the slow, clarifying cruelty of evidence. When stakes rose, his language sharpened. He used certainty like a tool, and more often than not, like a weapon. He treated silence as a space to fill rather than a surface to respect. He framed mistakes as singular acts of carelessness instead of systems with causes. He rewarded compliance with words that reduced people to tasks and punished dissent with the weight of his voice. "This is why they left," he wrote on a napkin in a diner, the paper puckering as he traced his pen across it. "Not because we failed, because I spoke like we failed by choice." He felt the rawness of that admission. For the first time in his life, he could see the architecture of his own downfall. His words had been the scaffolding he always assumed would hold, but they had been built without consultation, without load tests, and they collapsed under stress. The realization felt like a wound that contained something other than pain. It felt like data. If you want to stay with him through what comes next, keep listening. It was a small line, said without flourish, but it was a hinge. The next days were a descent and a kind of recognition. He didn't go meekly. Shame doesn't yield to humility quickly. It corrodes into anger and then trickles into loneliness. He lost sleep. He stopped answering calls. He spent afternoons walking aimlessly through city parks where joggers moved with indifferent purpose, past coffee bars where conversations sounded like distant radio. He returned to the scene of one of his worst mistakes, the conference center where he'd given an industry talk that had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. The stage curtains were down. Cleaning crews moved like a slow current. He sat in an empty foyer and called the number of someone he hadn't spoken to in years, a person who had once worked under him and left when the culture shifted, a woman named Maya Rivera. She had been on the receiving end of a sharper side of his leadership. He had never imagined she would answer. "Hello?" she said, and there was no surprise in her voice, only a clarity that suggested she had been awaiting this call in some form.
"Ethan," he said, the name feeling unnatural, as if he were auditioning for the role of the person he had been. "You're quiet," she said. Maya was spare in her words. She rarely wasted a syllable. "I am," he admitted. "I need to talk." She asked him to meet for coffee. He wanted to decline, to collapse into excuses, but he went. Maya ran a small consultancy that worked with leaders who wanted to stop repeating the same mistakes. She looked nothing like the image he'd conjured in his memory. She was both softer and harder, older in a way that suggested experience, younger in a way that suggested urgency. She listened as he spilled the meeting, the sentence, the fallout. She waited until he ran out of breath. "There's a difference between being decisive and being declarative in a way that collapses others," she said. "Words can create truth. They can bend a team toward possibility, or they can fold the map so no one knows where to go." He blinked. It was a phrase out of a book, but the timbre of it made it land inside him like something practical. She didn't offer platitudes. She observed. She updated him on people. She told him, in a voice that mixed compassion and rigor, that his pain was useful if he was willing to treat it as data. "Most people treat shame like a verdict," she said. "You have to treat it like a signal." The next hour felt like opening a toolbox for the first time in years. Maya didn't give him a pep talk. She sketched, on a napkin, a framework she used with clients. 5 pillars. She labeled them in careful handwriting and then set the napkin between them like a map. Certainty architecture, she said. Declarative dominance. Emotional regulation and tonality. Pacing and strategic pause. Value-first communication. The words were not mystical. She translated them immediately. Certainty isn't swagger. It's a structure you build. Clear commitments, transparent trade-offs, and a manageable number of priorities. Declarative language carries less hedging. It's how you name reality without casting blame. Tonality is the weather of your voice. The forecast matters. Pause is not absence. It's leverage. And value first means you anchor your speech to what others care about before you ask anything of them. Ethan felt both relieved and unnerved. She had put words to things he'd felt for years but hadn't owned. She didn't absolve him. She made space for responsibility. "Can I coach you?" she asked. "Not to make you invisible, but to make you legible. To help you practice saying things that don't erode the very trust you need to lead." He could have said no. Pride was a heavy, habitual thing. But there was a tiredness in him that had nowhere to go except into repair. He nodded. The first sessions were awkward. Maya's office was a converted loft with a plan of the city pinned on the wall, posted flags marking projects. She asked him to walk her through a recent conversation where he felt he had misfired. He did. He spoke, and she stopped him, not with a lecture, but with a gentle interruption. "Say that line again," she asked. He repeated it, the cadence the same as it had been hours before, when the room had opened into accusation. "Now," she said, "say it like you are naming what is already true, not to punish, but to invite repair." He tried. The words fell differently. They landed lighter, but still had the imprint of intent. Maya asked him bluntly to record it. "Record," she said. "Then listen."
Listening to himself was brutal. His voice sounded smaller through the playback, but the things he had been doing became clear. Qualifiers at the end of statements, a rising tone that begged approval, a tendency to fill silence with explanation. He heard the way he used declarative sentences as a rod instead of a beam. Practice an opening, Maya coached, for a one-on-one. Start with a fact, follow with your intention, end with an invitation. Don't fix everything. Make a clear request. He left that day with a short checklist scribbled in his pocket. It felt like a child's chart. He had laughed at it at first. Later that night, alone, he read it aloud. The act of saying the lines out loud felt like putting muscle memory into sentences. Days became small laboratories. He started with low-stakes environments, coffee with a former vendor, a call with a junior engineer. He set his phone to record. He practiced declarative openings like a musician plays scales. We missed the deadline. I am committed to understanding why. I want your perspective for 30 minutes. He felt ridiculous, and then, slowly, less so. He learned to notice his breathing. Before, breath had been something he didn't regard, an afterthought. Now Maya had him count intake and release. He noticed that when he exhaled fully before speaking, his sentences were shorter, more measured, less performative. He learned to anchor his gaze so it didn't become a hunt for dominance. There were relapses. In a meeting about cutbacks, when the pressure spiked, he felt the old burn of urgency. He caught himself forming a sentence that would close out debate by declaring blame. His cheek went hot with the memory of the boardroom. He stopped. He exhaled. He counted to 3. He did not speak the sentence. It felt like a small miracle, and also like a thin reed of possibility. Someone in the room, a mid-level manager named Dan, took a breath and offered an alternative way to phrase the problem. The energy in the room changed. It wasn't that Ethan was suddenly humble. It was that he had chosen restraint and created space. Maya called it the pause as leverage. She demonstrated with a quiet exercise. 2 people in the room. One asks a question. The other waits. The waiting creates a tension that draws out more truthful responses. Silence, she said, is not absence. It is a lever that reveals information. People will fill it, she told him, and what they fill it with matters.
The first time he used it intentionally felt like a power play, and it wasn't. At a team update, Ari raised concerns about timelines. There was a roil of defensiveness in Ethan's chest. He could have counterattacked, defend projections, name scapegoats. Instead, he held his breath, let his shoulders loosen, and waited. The room shifted. Ari softened mid-sentence, and under the weight of silence, offered an explanation that included constraints Ethan had not known. The pause had opened a seam. The conversation moved from accusation to joint problem-solving. He logged small wins, meeting notes that reflected shared ownership, tensions that de-escalated before they exploded. But the work also became a mirror. Practicing declarative language forced him to reckon with what he actually believed. Certainty architecture required him to prune commitments he hadn't intended to keep. Ethical influence meant he had to stop leveraging proximity to authority as currency. He started to ask himself honest questions in the harsh light of those mornings. Which promises had he made because they sounded good? Which had he signed others up for to look decisive? What obligations could he release without violating trust? There were moments of humiliation that were instructive. During a role play, he returned to an old default, piling on data to win an argument, and Maya stopped him. Information is not a substitute for invite, she said. The more you prove, the less people feel included. He realized he'd been collecting data to shore up his ego, not to help others make better decisions. The distinction was subtle and mighty. Maya introduced the language of declarative dominance, not as aggression, but as clarity. She taught him how to be concise without being dismissive. Saying fewer words with firmer intention gives others the permission to step in, she said. When you over-explain, you diminish the space for others' thinking. A practice regimen formed. Daily recordings of 5 minutes, weekly simulated conversations with Maya, 3 deliberate pauses a day, and a reading log on persuasion ethics. He kept a journal because he had always been a man of metrics. The journal entries were brutal at first. Journal, day 12. I thought I was practicing,
Mostly I am trying to avoid embarrassment. Today I silenced myself twice and felt like I had hidden. Then Samira asked a clarifying question, and the room shifted. There is a small victory in noticing, not acting on every defensive impulse. That might be the new starting point. He also started to test the social dynamics. In a lunch with his leadership team, he framed a past mistake differently. Instead of pointing fingers at the product team for slippage, he said, "We committed to a launch timeline that didn't match the resourcing. That's on me for pushing too hard without reconciling priorities. Here's how I propose we fix it, and here's where I need your expertise." The room exhaled.
People offered practical fixes rather than excuses. It was not universal forgiveness. Old grievances peeked out, but the tone changed. Practice also revealed how much he'd relied on volume to occupy authority. Where he used to quickly talk through doubt, he now used short declarative sentences that left room. "We'll realign priorities. We'll extend the timeline. We'll redirect 2 engineers." He noticed something strange. The team moved faster when he spoke less. The paradox was thrilling and humbling. Maya pushed him to define certainty architecture, not as an inner state, but as an external practice. "Make commitments you can keep," she advised. "State trade-offs clearly. Agree in public what the real priorities are. That is how you build structural certainty, not by pretending to have perfect answers, but by creating a system that reduces ambiguity." He began to draft what he called the 3 commitments, a simple document that laid out the top priorities, the resources assigned, and the decision gates for the quarter. He circulated it, not as an edict, but as a living draft. He invited edits. For the first time in years, he felt the texture of accountability that was not performative, but woven into process. Not everything improved. In an offhand hallway conversation with a journalist, a sarcastic remark slipped out, an old reflex. The piece that followed made his words look worse than they were. Headlines do not read context. The shame returned, deeper and colder. Someone in the organization forwarded the article to a private advisory group. He wanted to respond with anger, to reclaim the narrative. Instead, he made a different kind of choice, one that did not feel like weakness. He drafted a note to the leadership team. He did not write to deflect or to explain every phrase. He wrote to acknowledge, to outline immediate steps for behavior change, and to invite feedback. He used the framework they'd been practicing: acknowledge, own, provide solutions, tailor to stakeholders. The note felt raw and right. It was not perfect. It was transparent. Some teammates accepted it. Others remained distant. The gap between intentions and perception had not died. Trust is not a switch. It is currency earned by regular deposits. He had been bankrupt in that account, and rebuilding would take transactions he might find humbling. Maya never sugarcoated the time it would take. She introduced him to the idea of deliberate practice, not as a motivational slogan, but as a method. "You will mess up," she said. "The goal is to be able to fall forward." She required him to keep a remediation log. Every time he felt he failed, he had to write the situation, the impulse, the action taken, and a microplan for the next time. The table was simple but brutal. One evening, after a long day where an internal memo he had issued failed to land, and people read it as a top-down directive, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote a long entry. Journal, Day 27. I am tired of rehearsing apologies. What I am learning is this: apology without plan is cheap. People know when words are a bandage. They want structure. They want commitments. They want to watch habits form. I am trying to replace sentences with systems. The systems will take longer to build. When he wrote, "replace sentences with systems," he meant it. He began to design rituals. A weekly listening hour where any employee could sign up to speak and not be interrupted by status updates. A public decision log documenting who decided what and why. A transparency protocol for client communications. These were small, visible shifts, structural changes that made his attempts at better speech less performative. The first time someone called the listening hour the most honest meeting we've had, he felt something close to relief. It wasn't a cure. It was an indication that when you give people the space to speak and mean it, they will. Maya emphasized ethical influence at each turn. Influence is not coercion, she reminded him. It is alignment, helping people see the value of a chosen course. It's offering reasons they can accept, not compelling them to agree.
She walked him through reciprocity, how giving without immediate expectation builds moral capital. She taught him to respect social proof, how the behavior of a few early adopters can shift norms. But she also warned about weaponizing scarcity in urgency. Use urgency to mobilize, not to panic, she said. If you manufacture panic, you break trust. Ethan practiced all of this in small, intense ways. He started sending short, value-first notes. Instead of a directive, he'd write, "Here's what we're trying to achieve and why it matters to our customers. I need your perspective on 2 options." The response rate improved. More importantly, the content of responses became richer. People corrected him less often, but that didn't mean they agreed more. It meant they were engaging. In the middle of this slow, uneven work came a test that felt like a pebble in his shoe. A client, one of the accounts that had left during his worst week, reached out to request a renegotiation. The client was cautious, wounded, and exacting. They wanted evidence of change beyond words. They wanted assurance that the culture that had caused the failure had been altered. He could have sent a crafted slide deck, reheated case studies, or a defensive timeline that minimized their pain. Instead, he arranged a meeting and came with 3 things: an acknowledgement, a plan that included measurable steps, and a small, specific ask that transferred some control back to them. He used declarative language, clear facts, clear commitments, then paused and listened. The conversation was not theatrical. It wasn't a cinematic confession. It was a sequence of small actions. He named the failure, he outlined the corrective actions, he asked for their priorities, and paused several times to let them speak.
The pauses were not ornamental. They were deliberate levers. When they expressed skepticism, he responded not with defensiveness, but with a willingness to create a pilot arrangement that would allow them to test the new behaviors. The client accepted a short-term contract with explicit check-in points. It was not a restoration of everything. It was a single, measurable step, a deposit in the trust account he had run down. He celebrated privately, quietly. The victory felt fragile, but it was real. By the time a month had passed since he began working with Maya, the scaffold he was building looked different. The 5 pillars had words now, but they were less theoretical and more muscular. Each represented a practice, not a promise. Certainty architecture was a living doc with explicit trade-offs. Declarative dominance was a habit of one-sentence openings and invitations. Emotional regulation was breathing and tonal awareness under stress. Pacing and pause had become rehearsal cues. Value-first communication was a commitment to anchor requests in someone else's priorities before asking for anything. He still woke some nights with a shame that tasted like cold iron. He still imagined headlines. He still caught himself wanting to cut people off mid-explanation. But there were new patterns, too. He felt the room before he filled it. He felt the urge to speak and then chose to wait. He offered small, tactical concessions that tested whether people were joining him or just complying out of fear. The work was lonely sometimes. Friends observed the change and asked if he felt lighter. He did feel lighter in his chest in some ways, but heavier in a responsible way. He had moved from the vanity of being right to the labor of being reliable. Maya warned him about a particular danger. "Practice in private is not enough," she said one cold afternoon as they walked along a river where the city seemed quieter. "You will fail publicly. The question is whether you have an architecture to absorb the failure. Systems are the absorbers." She asked him to design a rapid remediation protocol for when he slipped, acknowledge quickly, own the harm, outline immediate steps for repair, and invite stakeholder-specific input. The structure itself felt like a scaffold. His old instinct had been to hide failures or to defend them. Now he had a sequence to enact that protected people and moved everyone forward. He began to test the protocol in low-stakes situations. When he misspoke in a cross-functional threat, he took responsibility publicly, laid out corrective action, and requested a short meeting to walk through specifics. People noticed. They responded with pragmatic suggestions rather than amusement. The team's reactions were varied. Priya remained cautious, often offering the kind of questions that cut clean to the heart of accountability. Ari oscillated between curiosity and skepticism.
Ben, formerly a doubter, began to volunteer small acts of trust, delegating a client call to a junior who needed exposure. Samira, who had drifted during the worst of the crisis, began attending the new listening hours, and in hesitant increments, contributing thought leadership that the group had missed when he spoke over others. Ethan kept a running list of failures and repairs. The list read like a ledger of growth, sometimes discouraging, sometimes encouraging. He used it in coaching check-ins with Maya and shared parts of it with a close confidant, someone outside the company who offered blunt compassion. Then an arrow landed, a leak in the product pipeline that threatened a key release. It wasn't a catastrophe yet, it was a test. The glitch was technical, but the fallout would be reputational if handled poorly. Old reflexes tugged, quick blame, expedited messaging, a message crafted to reassure without admitting depth. He felt the old cadence rise in his chest, the performance of certainty. This time, though, a different voice answered. It was Maya's voice, taught through practice. Name the facts, own the responsibility in the structural sense, propose a time-bound remediation, and tailor messages to each stakeholder group. He convened a cross-functional huddle, and instead of speaking to perform, he listened to draw reality into the open. He used a declarative opening. We have an integrity issue in Release X. Here are the facts. Here is the immediate plan. Here is how I failed to foresee it. And here's where I need your expertise. He paused between each item and let the silence invite others in. The team reacted not with automatic compliance, but with engagement. Engineers outlined fixes. Customer success mapped client messaging. Legal raised prudent cautions. He did not dominate. He orchestrated. The choreography was clumsy at times, but it held. By the time the meeting ended, there was a plan that sounded like repair. It relied on humility, but it also relied on craft. It required him to hold a painful truth and to hold others' agency at the same time. It was a brittle alliance, but an alliance nonetheless. As he left the room, he felt the shape of something new, authority that arrived from shared agency rather than from solitary decrees. The sensation was not triumphant. It was instead hard-earned and slightly terrifying. He knew a larger test was coming. The leak could escalate. Clients could respond harshly. Investors could ask for a scapegoat. The old part of him wanted to retreat into defensive certainty. The new part wanted to continue to practice the habits that had, in the past weeks, produced minor but meaningful shifts. He chose practice. He committed that night to a more structured regimen. 30 days of deliberate practice with milestones, recordings, role plays, public remediation rehearsals, weekly feedback loops with a small cohort inside the company who agreed to hold him accountable.
He wrote the plan in his journal. Journal, day 34. I am not fixed, not by a long shot, but there is a perimeter now, a place where I can see my impulses forming and choose differently. This month is a test of endurance, not a magic trick. He felt ready, but readiness carried tension. Change had momentum, but it also had exposure. He had to be prepared to fail in front of others and to use those failures as fuel for repair. The team had, in small increments, begun to offer him trust again, but that trust would not be blind. It would be earned in transactions, unflashy, repetitive, and visible. That night he sat in the dark of his apartment, the city skyline a smear of sodium lights and rehearsed sentences. He practiced opening lines, practiced pausing, practiced listening until he could feel the difference in his gut between dominating a room and inviting action. He recorded his voice, listened, and adjusted. He had not yet faced the crisis that would reveal whether his new scaffolding held, but he had accepted the architecture of change. He had accepted that pain can be information rather than indictment. He had accepted that words are not decorative, they are structural, and he had decided to keep rebuilding, one deliberate practice at a time. He had accepted that words are not decorative, they are structural, and he had decided to keep rebuilding, one deliberate practice at a time. The warning signs arrived like weather reports, first a blip, then a front. The flaw in the release, at the time a technical leak, found vectors. A customer support transcript leaked to a forum, a short internal note misread as a mandate, an investor who wanted reassurance rather than nuance. By the time the public relations inbox filled, by the time the thread wound into the evening news cycle, what had begun as a product hiccup had the potential to become an existential crisis. Ethan woke before dawn to the soft vibration of his phone. The nation of unread messages made his chest hollow. He read a line from an investor. "We need to know you have this contained." There was a meeting scheduled in an hour with the most skeptical of the clients who'd left earlier. The
the same client he'd coaxed back into a pilot weeks before. This was the test he felt in his bones. He could feel the old reflexes assembling themselves like muscle memory. Snap, fix, declare. Close the gap with sound. But in the thin hours of morning, with the city still blue-gray outside his window, another realization sought with him. The stakes now required more than mechanics. They required presence. He dressed without thinking about optics, jeans, a button-down, and walked to the office in a purposeful silence. The city smelled of rain. He practiced the opening line he'd rehearsed the night before. "We have an integrity issue. Here are the facts. Here's the plan. Here's where I need your help." The sentence had been paired to essentials. It had declarative lake without accusation.
The huddle before the client call was sharp. Engineers crowding one side of the room spoke in technical cadence. Customer success sketched client pain. Legal leaned back with a guarded look. Priya read a draft message aloud. It landed and then creaked. Ben scrolled. Ari raised a procedural question. Samira's expression was unreadable, an island he hadn't yet reached. Ethan stood and unfolded the plan the way he'd learned to unfold it, a clear, bounded set of commitments, with trade-offs spelled out and decision gates visible. He named the 5 pillars in a sentence, broken now into practice, not theory. Certainty in commitments, declarative openings, tempered tonality, pause as leverage, and value-first messaging. "We're not here to bury blame," he said. "We are here to make this right and to do it publicly and measurably. Here's what we propose in the next 7 days." He spoke in concise sentences, each a handhold. He ended each point with who would be accountable and a decisive time gate. He then closed with a pause, a deliberate absence that felt almost combative in a room wired for talk. The silence drew responses. An engineer added a crucial constraint. Legal clarified a necessary protective language. Priya asked what communications would look like for clients. Ari questioned resourcing. In the space after his last sentence, the team filled the seam with expertise instead of accusation. They rehearsed a single message for the client call. Acknowledge, own structurally, not as theatrical confession, but as systemic responsibility. Present the solution roadmap, and then specifically ask the client what would restore their confidence. Ethan's voice was measured. The tone was steady. He counted his breath before the call. He used a declarative opening. "We discovered an integrity issue affecting Release X. These are the facts." He paused. The client voice on the other side of the line was smaller than the headlines, careful, wary, precise. On that line, he practiced pause as leverage twice. The client exposed pain points he hadn't known were families of issues. In the silence after the client's list, the engineer spoke up with a new mitigation and a testing cadence. Ethan reframed the narrative, not to dilute responsibility, but to reshape it. "Our failure was in anticipating that complexity, and we are proposing a staged path to show you change in 30, 60, 90 days. We will commit to check-ins that have public criteria. We will indemnify the most exposed segments for the next cycle." He paused again and asked for the client's priorities. The request shifted control. The client offered conditions that were narrower than he might have demanded if he were still the kind of leader who filled silence with spin. After the call, one of the client's leads emailed his skepticism in blunt terms. A journalist called. Their questions were sharp, and somewhere in the background, someone tweeted a line from a leaked transcript.
The crisis was breathing. The pressure mounted. The board requested a brief for a late-night session. Investors wanted a call. A subset of customers asked for immediate refunds. That night, the group canceled the late dinner they'd planned for morale and instead huddled under fluorescent lights. He could feel his pulse in his throat. Old ways whispered that leadership looks unshakable in the moments of storm. But being unshakable, he'd learned, often meant air-filled bravado. This would require a different kind of firmness, a structure that held people, not a voice that overrode them. The meeting with investors the next morning nearly unstitched him. One of the men on the call, an influential figure whose temper had been legendary, asked whether the team had a plan for reputational damage and how they would prevent future leaks. The old Ethan would have talked tornadoes of data, timelines, and arguments until the other party was worn out. He almost did. He could feel the cadence climbing, his voice ready to steamroll dissent. Maya's face flashed into his mind, not literally, but as a practice silhouette, reminding him to slow, to breathe, to leave space. He intervened by choosing one sentence at a time. He began with a crisp structure, the facts, the plan, the metrics, the governance.
He named the trade-offs, what they'd stop doing and why, so the investors could see the realism embedded in the certainty. He then paused, allowing the investors' follow-up questions to surface specifics rather than assumptions. Instead of pushing to appear omniscient, he invited a small pilot. Allow us 90 days of monitored progress with specific gates. If we fail any of the agreed criteria, we will trigger governance that you can oversee. The investor's tone softened. The offer transferred a measure of control and invited oversight rather than defensiveness. It also aligned incentives and honored the principle of reciprocity. Share risk and oversight, and you share confidence. Despite these careful moves, cracks appeared. During a midday town hall meant to inform staff, a question from an engineer about leadership culture cut more deeply than logistics. Ethan felt himself climb into a familiar place, the shout of certainty that had seduced him before. He heard his voice tense. For a moment, he was the man who had once used certainty to silence. In the room tightened. He caught himself, then didn't catch himself in time. He answered sharply, an edge of impatience in his tone that made several faces close. Later, sitting alone in a glassed conference room, he played back the tape as Maya had taught him. He heard the rising pitch, the defensive qualifiers. He felt the shame like cold on his hands. The ledger of past mistakes flashed in his mind. He had promised not to become that man again. He used the remediation protocol he designed.
He pulled up the remediation note on his phone, and then, with the kind of humility that is difficult in public life, he opened the company forum and wrote, "I responded poorly in the town hall. I spoke with impatience and pushed past a question when we should have listened. That was my failure. Here's what I will do to make this right. 1. A smaller listening session with the engineering team this week to unpack concerns. 2. A public airing of the decision log that led to release timing. And 3. A weekly open office hour for 2 months. I welcome feedback on whether these steps are sufficient." It was not a theatrical apology. It was short, procedural, and actionable. The forum filled with measured replies, some skeptical, some grateful. Priya DM'd him an empathetic correction. "Nice move. Keep it targeted." The remediation calmed a small part of the room. People noticed that accountability had a pattern, a rhythm, and that patterns felt safer than sudden performance. That evening, the client sent a message more severe than expected. They wanted a face-to-face negotiation with 3 conditions: public assurances, independent audits, and the right to terminate without penalties within 90 days if expectations were not met. The board wanted him to insist on stricter terms. His calendar began to resemble a runway for tension. He prepared for the negotiation like a pilot, methodically running a checklist. He brought a concise, declarative opening, mapped trade-offs in a certainty architecture document, rehearsed tonal anchors with an engineer who would become his sounding board, and practiced silence as a tactic, how long to wait after an ask, how a pause could coax specifics from a reticent negotiator. He also rehearsed his ethics. Influence in this room would be about alignment, not leverage. He intended to offer concessions the firm could stand behind, and to ask for co-creation rather than capitulation. Negotiations began in a glassed conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet. The client's delegation was austere. The lead negotiator, an old hand, started with the hard line. "We need assurance that this won't happen again. Financial penalties won't change the culture." He paused for effect. Ethan felt the urge to fill that pause, to counter with fast talk. He counted his breath. He used the declarative opening. "We failed to anticipate the risk profile, and we accept structural responsibility. Here are the guardrails we are committing to immediately." He unfolded the certainty architecture: independent audits, a public decision log, third-party monitors for the next quarter, and a pilot governance board, including client representation. He then paused in the space after saying, "And here's what we need from you." He was careful. This was not a silent trap. He framed their inclusion as a partnership, not a concession of weakness. The client asked for specific checkpoints and the right to meet weekly with the governance board. They wanted the power to trigger a review. Ethan agreed, naming the trade-offs in the scope. He then did something he had not done in the past. He asked them, not demanded, that if, after 30 days of the pilot, they saw evidence of progress, they consider a small gesture of reciprocity, sharing a joint case study about how partners can help companies restructure to serve customers better. It was a modest ask, and it acknowledged their pain while offering them a visible sign of value. Reciprocity, used ethically, can rebuild moral capital. The client listened. The contract negotiated into a 90-day pilot with embedded oversight and a clause for a public transparency report. He walked out of the negotiation, shaken and relieved. He had used the tools, declarative openings, pause, value-first framing, but also something subtler, the willingness to share authority. He had not sought to win, he had sought to align. The days that followed were a montage of disciplined practice, small wins, and painful learning. Ethan moved like a man on a regimen. He kept the daily 5-minute voice recordings, which now included not only his words, but micro-rehearsals of difficult conversations. He was honest in his remediation logs. He convened weekly cohort sessions, composed of 5 people across functional lines, an internal accountability group that gave feedback and rehearsed scenarios. He implemented the listening hour as a ritual, public and sacred. He instituted a public decision log that traced who decided what and why, a document people could interrogate. He also extended the learning outward. Samira, who had re-engaged after initial distance, asked if he would mentor a member of her new project team. It was a small request: introduce a promising junior to the art of presenting to senior stakeholders. He accepted, but not in his old fashion of directive lectures. He sat in the back of the room and listened. He offered a short debrief after the presentation, a declarative compliment, one area for growth, and a small invitation for practice. The mentee, a nervous woman named Lila, left the room more steady than when she arrived. Watching Lila, Ethan felt the early shape of a different energy, influence used to grow others, not to grant him status. In parallel, he kept failing and repairing. A press statement crafted in the gray hours misread the tone in a way that made the company sound defensive. An investor called angrily. He took responsibility publicly, corrected course, and adjusted the public communications process, so press drafts had at least 2 stakeholder reviewers. The embarrassment stung. The system held. 30 days of the stricter regimen passed into 60. The technical fix on Release X held under load tests. The customer's weekly check-ins showed improvement. The independent audit, while noting areas for improvement, pointed to increasing adherence to the remediation gates.
Priya, who had been cautious since the boardroom blow-up, began to offer small public endorsements in meetings. Ben entrusted a junior with a client call and later thanked Ethan for creating the space to let that happen. These were deposits, not full balances. Trust remained tentative, but there were measurable shifts. Then came the real surge. An unanticipated legal exposure emerged in the form of a competitor claiming misuse of client data, an allegation that, if not handled precisely, could spiral. The legal team insisted on a firm line. Some in the board wanted a vocal rebuttal, others asked for silence. Media outlets scented drama. The default playbook for many organizations in that position is to assert denial, slash with rhetoric, enclose ranks. Ethan knew that style had been his earlier habit, to drown complexity in certainty. Instead, he convened the Crisis Council and did what they'd rehearsed in the drills Maya had helped him design. He opened the team by naming the facts. He then used the crisis communication sequence they'd practiced, acknowledge the situation plainly, own structural responsibility where appropriate, provide a clear solution roadmap, and tailor messages to each stakeholder group. He scripted the public message to the press, acknowledged the allegation, explain the ongoing investigation, promise transparency, and invite independent review. Then he asked the customer base for patience and provided a direct line to customer success for any concerns. He asked investors for the ability to implement a remediation plan with oversight. In the investor call, he used declarative sentences and clear trade-offs. In the public message, his tonality was steady and controlled. During the public press Q&A, a reporter attempted to bait him with insinuations. He felt himself tighten, but he used the pause again, this time longer, silent, long enough for the room to shift. Silence answered before he did. A senior engineer, standing with him, offered a technical clarification that answered the reporter's question with facts. The silence had made space for a different voice to carry truth. The press cycle did not vanish, but its bite dulled. The team had not only fixed problems, but had become a chorus rather than a single solo. Negotiation with the competitor's counsel resolved not with scorched earth tactics, but with a willingness to submit to external validation for a narrow set of claims. A joint statement, crafted with legal prudence and with a tone that neither capitulated nor castigated, stabilized public perception. The competitor dropped the more egregious claims. The independent validation cleared the company on the most consequential points.
These were outcomes that came from a careful architecture of response, not from performative bravado. In the quiet after the peak, when the air seemed to thin and the team cleaned up the final tasks, Ethan sat at his desk and wrote in his journal.
Journal, Day 78. I've learned that crises don't forgive performance, they reward presence. I keep thinking of silence as a muscle. The more I exercise it, the less reflexive my shouts. I am not fixed. I am different in that I notice my reflexes and have systems to arrest them. The work is the same work every day, to practice until the better habits beat the old ones. The changes became institutional. The public decision log fed into weekly leadership reviews. The listening hour turned into a cross-functional practice group where one person presented a difficult conversation they'd had and the group gave feedback. A remediation board, small, composed of legal, customer success, engineering, and a client representative, met when issues required rapid, transparent correction. The company instituted a training program for people who found their voices shaky in high-pressure moments. It taught declarative openings, tonal exercises, and pause practice. It was not a theatrical academy for charismatic leaders. It was a practical school and communication craftsmanship. Ethan began to mentor more formally. He started a small cohort of emerging leaders who met every Thursday. After an initial session of awkward attempts, the cohort developed norms, short declarative feedback cycles, peer recording reviews, and a rule that every critique had to include an actionable next step. He taught not as an omniscient guru, but as a practitioner who still burned himself and still repaired. He showed them his remediation logs and encouraged them to start their own. One young leader in the cohort, Malik, asked him a question that echoed in Ethan's chest for days. Will I ever not be scared of breaking things with my words? Ethan wanted to tell Malik that fear disappears, that confidence builds, and that pain evaporates. Instead, he answered plainly, no, fear will always be part of this. The point is to build a scaffold so fear doesn't cost other people their dignity. Build the scaffold and you'll learn to act from purpose instead of panic. Around the 75th day, the company convened an offsite to take stock. The mood was deliberate, not celebratory. That suited Ethan. There was no rush to the trophy. He walked in and saw teams speaking to each other with new steadiness. He watched Samira lead a breakout session on client empathy. He heard Ben present a case study on delegation. Priya moderated a tough discussion about resource trade-offs with a fairness that would have unnerved his old self. The meeting had the shape of a team whose voice was distributed rather than concentrated. At the offsite, Maya sat in the back and watched with an unreadable expression. After the day wound down, she found Ethan on a balcony, night wind lifting the edge of his coat. You look different, she said, in the same spare tone that had first disarmed him months earlier. He laughed softly. Different enough to be dangerous, he said. Maya shook her head.
Different enough to be human, she corrected. You learned the tools. Now the question is what you'll give them to others. He had already started giving. The company rolled out a mentorship program where seasoned leaders paired with new managers for 6-week cycles of deliberate practice. The onboarding materials now included a module on declarative openings and pause practice. Hiring interviews began to include a culture conversation about how people handle conflict. The scaffolding was published in a way, publicly stated commitments, shared rituals, and the expectation of remediation. Still, he kept failing in small ways. Once, in a closed-door strategy session where the stakes felt existential, he caught himself using certainty to bamboozle a stray dissent. A junior interrupted with an alternative, and his old reflex pushed him to silence the dissent by naming the danger. The room froze. He stopped himself mid-sentence. He felt his face heat. He used the remediation note he carried now and apologized in the moment, then opened the next segment to a discussion instead of a monologue. It was not perfect, but it was repair in real time. The junior thanked him afterward. The ledger shifted again. Months after the fall, a journalist who had once written a damning piece requested an interview. The angle was the redemption story, always a juicy genre. Ethan accepted. He could have polished the narrative into a tidy arc: fall, learn, triumph. Instead, he spoke with the same cadence he'd cultivated: concise, honest, grounded in examples, careful to avoid grand promises. He told the journalist about the 5 pillars and how each became practice. He told stories of failure, of snapping in the town hall, of a botched press statement. He told 2 of the mechanics: the decision log, the listening hour, the remediation board. At one point, the journalist leaned forward and asked, "Do you regret the things you did?" He paused. It would have been easy to perform remorse. He held the pause long enough that silence became an invitation.
"Yes and no," he said finally. "I regret the harm caused, but the harm also gave me data I couldn't ignore. My job now is to learn from it and to structure the company so that others are protected from the kind of harm my words caused." Silence again. The reporter scribbled. The interview ran as a nuanced piece, hard on him for the mistakes, measured on the response. The final test, public, procedural, and almost mythic, came at the 90-day mark. The board convened to evaluate whether the pilot with the disgruntled client would shift into a long-term partnership. Investors watched. The independent auditors would present their latest findings. The room had the tone of a tribunal and the heartbeat of hope. Ethan prepared by revisiting the practices that had carried him thus far.
He sat with the most difficult staff members privately and asked for two things: candid feedback and permission to be judged on measurable progress. He practiced his openings until they felt muscle-worthy. He rehearsed responding to hostile questions. He prepared the structure of the presentation: facts, trade-offs, metrics, and the human stories of repair. And then he left space for others to speak. When the meeting unfolded, he led in a way that felt almost surgical in its simplicity. The auditors presented evidence of process adherence. The client representatives testified to incremental trust, small positive experiences that had aggregated. The engineer, who had once been the most skeptical, described a technical fix and how a new rapid remediation protocol had prevented regression. The numbers were not perfect, but they pointed upward. At the end, an investor asked the moral question: how do we know this will last? Ethan responded not with a flourish, but with a plan. The 3 commitments document they had refined into policy, the public decision log, the remediation board, the new governance structure where clients had partial oversight in sensitive areas, and crucially, the cultural interventions, listening hours and cohort practice that institutionalized behavior change. He invited the board to a small experiment, to set 3 measurable gates for the next quarter, and to allow a governance observer role for one investor. The request distributed risk. It acknowledged imperfection. It asked for partnership. The vote was close, but moved to an approval. The client agreed to extend the engagement under the pilot parameters. The independent audit flagged areas for improvement, but confirmed movement. When the room broke, people moved slowly, as if the air had changed. Some shook hands, others hugged. Priya caught his eye, and with a small, tight smile, mouthed, "You did it." He didn't feel triumphant so much as relieved and alert. Relief had a texture he did not expect. It was humble. Ethan's personal ledger read differently now. It included missteps and repairs, measures and rituals, and a growing list of people whose work weaved into rehabilitation. He was not a singular hero returned to glory. He was a leader in the process of becoming someone his team could trust more permanently. In the months after, he transformed the ad hoc practices into an explicit implementation plan for the organization and for himself. He wrote it as if it were a manual he wished he'd had years ago, but kept it brief and specific. The plan was practical, behavioral, and repeatable. Baseline assessment: map the current decision log, identify 3 recurring communication failures, and interview 10 stakeholders for qualitative evidence of trust gaps. Priority selection: pick 3 commitments, the 3 commitments that can be sustained for a quarter. State resources and trade-offs publicly.
Deliberate practice: daily voice recordings for 10 to 20 minutes, 3 deliberate pauses per day, weekly role-play sessions with a small cohort, and a 5-minute remediation journal entry after every notable misstep. Real-world application: apply declarative openings in every major stakeholder conversation. Use value-first framing in at least 3 client interactions per week. Run a weekly listening hour. Mastery integration: after 60 days, hold a measured evaluation, independent audit of communications, a peer review of recorded conversations, and a satisfaction survey from staff and a representative client. Sustainability systems: create a remediation board, maintain a public decision log, formalize mentorship cohorts, and schedule quarterly public updates on progress. He shared the plan with the board and the leadership team, but he wrote it in accessible terms, tools, not slogans. He published the plan internally and asked 3 people outside the company to hold him to it: Maya, an independent auditor, and a peer CEO who had been through his own crisis. The act of publicizing the plan was itself a form of commitment architecture, certainty practiced in public.
Ethan also built personal rituals into his life to protect the habits that had become essential. He kept his nightly recordings. He kept the remediation notebook within reach. He scheduled listening hours even when it hurt. He made a private promise to maintain an accountability cohort for his own leadership. No solitary ascents. He returned to the small, exact tasks he had once thought beneath him. He sat in entry-level meetings, listened, and learned the language of people doing the work. He read transcripts not to find blame, but to find friction points. He taught Leela to lead a stakeholder call, and she did so with a modest competence that felt enormous to him. Sometimes late at night, he still woke to the memory of the hand that had once slammed a gavel of certainty and silenced a room. The memory now served a different purpose, not as a source of shame that shrank him, but as information that shaped repair. He would not pretend the pain had been ennobling on its own. Pain had been a harsh teacher, but it had become data for purpose. The company stabilized. The release that had leaked performed steadily in the field. Customer churn fell. The pilot turned into a longer-term relationship with the client who'd once been most skeptical. Investors who had been braced for collapse began to speak of the company as an example of procedural correction. Headlines remained skeptical in places, but the narratives shifted from scandal to case study. One afternoon, months after the worst of it, Ethan walked into a small room where the cohort met. The room smelled of coffee and dry erase markers. He sat in the middle of a circle and listened as Malik, the young cohort member, practiced a hard conversation with a peer.
Ethan watched the exchange and noticed how Malik used a declarative opening, then paused in the places they drilled, and how the peer responded with candor rather than defensiveness. The scene felt like a small miracle, influence used to grow agency, not to extract it. He found himself repeating Maya's spare admonition, now in the voice of experience rather than bookish curiosity. Words are scaffolding. Keep testing the load. On a late afternoon, he took the elevator down to the lobby, where a journalist from a trade magazine had requested a follow-up on leadership lessons. They sat in the quiet atrium and spoke about architecture of certainty, not as swagger, but as a system. He explained the mechanics of declarative openings and brief pauses and why they worked, because they created cognitive room for others to respond honestly. He explained value-first communication, not as a technique, but as the practice of anchoring asking in others' priorities. He emphasized that none of these practices guaranteed smooth outcomes. They simply increased the probability of constructive response. "You turned your pain into wisdom," the journalist said at one point, the line capturing the arc they'd all been living. He looked at the reflection of his hand in the glass and then back at the reporter. "It hasn't finished turning yet," he said. "Wisdom is a habit, not an arrival." That evening, he wrote a brief final entry in his journal, not as a flourish, but as a commitment. Journal, Day 120. This is not a victory lap, it's a map. Pain taught me what to notice. The work is daily, deliberate, boring, and hard. The only durable thing I can offer is a set of routines others can use. If you are reading this, if you've ever felt the sharpness of a sentence break something, remember this. Start small, record often, ask for accountability, and build systems so you don't have to be perfect. Be repairable. He closed the notebook, and in the last page, left a note to himself. Continue the practice. Keep the public scaffolds. Teach others. In the months after, more leaders within and outside the company reached out, wanting to learn the framework they'd used. Ethan began to run short workshops, practical sessions that taught declarative openings, pause exercises, and value-first framing. He insisted the sessions be grounded in ethics. Influence is alignment, not coercion. He taught how to apply reciprocity responsibly, and how to use social proof to model new norms rather than to manipulate them. One of the first workshop attendees, a director at a small nonprofit, later emailed him, "We started a listening hour. It's not fancy, but people come. It's changing our meetings." These small echoes mattered. They were evidence that the methods could be transferred. Ethan still kept the habits that had formed him. On some mornings, he would sit in the dark and practice a 3-sentence opening aloud. He recorded it, listened, and adjusted.
He still counted breaths before important conversations. He still used his remediation log. The rituals had become a kind of moral hygiene, daily actions that reduced the chance of harm. In the end, the most visible change was not a headline, but a practice. Leadership that recognized its capacity to harm and organized itself to prevent predictable damage. He no longer saw leadership as the ability to close a room with a sentence. He saw it as the ability to open one with a sentence that invited repair.
Before he left the company for a short sabbatical to teach the new mentorship cohorts, he addressed the leadership team one final time in the office where he had once felt a verdict. "You all taught me how to be trusted again," he said. "I want to give you a very practical challenge. It's what kept me from falling back into old patterns. Commit to a 90-day deliberate practice, 10 to 20 minutes a day. 3 pieces: recording, pause practice, and a remediation entry for any failure. Pair up with an accountability partner. Rehearse hard conversations in front of a cohort weekly. Keep a public decision log for 3 months. I promise I will do it with you." A murmur of assent moved the room. It was not theatrical. It was a set of small, hard promises. They would not guarantee outcomes. They would, however, increase the probability that the company would behave in ways that honored people. He left the company with a modest sense of peace. He had not become invulnerable. He had become more repairable. Ethan's last public act before stepping away was to publish a brief guide for others who might face similar ruptures. Not a manifesto, but a toolkit. It contained the concrete steps he had followed: baseline assessment, priority selection, deliberate practice schedule, real-world application, mastery integration, and sustainability systems. He wrote it plainly and included sample templates, a 3-commitment sheet, a remediation note template, a weekly role-play outline, and a 90-day calendar. He called the closing chapter of the guide "The Work," because that was what it always was: sustained labor in language and structure. On a cool morning, as he walked out of the building for the last time before his sabbatical, he took one last look at the glass facade and thought of scaffolding. The structure around the company had been altered, wider, more visible, built with public commitments. It would require maintenance. Systems rust, people forget. But there was now a culture that could notice when rust appeared and respond. He walked into the city and paused at a crosswalk. Cars flow. A bus hissed. He breathed and counted to 3 out of habit. The pause had become instinct, an old muscle that now stopped reflexive speech. He did not do it to seem deep. He did it because it worked.
If you are listening to this and something in this story resonates, if you have ever watched a sentence do damage and wanted to undo it, there is a practical route forward. Consider this the offer he gave to his team and the small public he served: a 90-day deliberate practice. It is not a magic wand. It is a regimen. A 90-day deliberate practice challenge. Baseline, days 1 through 7. Map 3 recurring communication failures and interview 5 stakeholders. Create the 3 commitments document. 3 prioritized commitments with trade-offs and accountable owners. Daily practice, days 8 through 90, 10 to 20 minutes per day. The session includes a short vocal warm-up and tonality check, 1 recorded 2-minute declarative opening, and a 5-minute remediation entry if any misstep occurred that day. Weekly rituals, 1 cohort role play, 60 minutes, with recorded feedback, 1 listening hour open to peers, 1 remediation review with your accountability partner. Monthly checks, publish 1 decision log update and run a mini audit. Compare recorded openings across weeks and seek independent feedback. Endlun, day 90. Present measurable outcomes. What changed in trust metrics, client responses, and internal satisfaction? Define the next 90-day cycle based on the evidence. Ethan did not promise that the challenge would fix everything. He promised that practicing the habits would change the probability of repair. He promised that practicing would make leaders more repairable and teams safer. He promised that the work would be stubborn, often humbling, and sometimes slow. He promised it would be worth the cost. He stepped onto the street, pulse even, and began his walk. Months later, when he returned from the sabbatical, he taught the cohorts, met new leaders who had used the 90-day challenge, and continued to practice the habits that had once saved his career from the tyranny of his own sentences. The last scene you will find isn't triumphant so much as ordinary. A circle of people in a small room, a set of voices taking turns, a young manager standing to practice a hard conversation, the leader, once broken, listening at the edge of the circle, counting his breath, ready to speak only when the moment calls for it. Words, he had learned, are the scaffolding of trust. Build them carefully. Keep testing the load. Repair when they fail. Repeat.